So I'm back with part 2, the suffering of Christ, the 7 last words that Christ said, and also the 14 stations. And getting back to this, and I'm trying to put a story to this, as I said. So we were getting back to this, that I was just reading before, that it was a dark hour and a dark night for Jesus. And we see here that he got up from prayer and went back to his disciples, found them asleep, drugged by grief. He said, "What business do you have sleeping? Get up, pray, so you won't give in to temptation." No sooner were the words out of his mouth than a crowd showed up. Judas, the one from the 12, in the lead, he came right up to Jesus to kiss him. Jesus said, "Judas, you would betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" And when those with him saw what was happening, they said, "Master, shall we fight?" One of them took a swing at the chief priest's servant and cut off the right ear. Jesus said, "Let them be, even in this." Then touching the servant's ear, he healed him. Jesus spoke to those who had come to the high priest, temple police, religion leaders, "What is jumping me, swords and clubs, if I were a dangerous criminal? Day after day I have been with you in the temple, and you're not so much as lifted a hand against me. But do it your way. It is dark night, but do it in your way. It is a dark night and a dark hour." So as we see here, although in the Old Testament it was predicted that a Messiah would come and what would happen to that Messiah to save the world, we can see that Jesus, even then, that Judas had betrayed Jesus with a kiss, that Jesus still showed the humility and the forgiveness. He healed the ear that was cut off. He healed that. So we see this, that though that Jesus is a forgiving God, Jesus is forgiving, and Jesus is showing his humility. The chief priest's servant had cut off his right ear, but Jesus still continued to show humility and do what his Father in heaven had told him to show, humility and compassion, though this was a dark hour and a dark night, and things were only going to become much worse. So while Jesus was praying in the garden of Gethsemane, not a stone throw away from his apostles, and asked them to pray, and they fell asleep, we see that Jesus is betrayed and he's arrested. While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, "Judas, you are betraying the Son of Man with a kiss." Luke 22, verses 48. When Jesus' followers saw that what's going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" And verse 50, and one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear and healed them. Jesus said, "No more of this." Judas had betrayed Jesus, and it was like that Jesus had already been told by his Father. He was in acceptance that this was his Father's will, and he was accepting with humility, compassion and forgiveness. And he was trying to reconciliate to the world, and showing that no matter how dark of a night it was going to be for Jesus and trouble, that he still showed forgiveness. So what we can see here is and after being taken to the high priest and questioned by them, Jesus stands trial before Pilate. Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes the payment of taxes, and Caesar and claims to be the Christ, a king. So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priest and the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." But they insisted, "He stirs up the people all over Judah, and by his teaching he has started in Galilee and has come all the way here." But we see here that Pilate announces the chief priest and the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." So here we have the first station of the cross. We have the first station of the cross, and just pausing for a minute and having a look at this picture. There's Jesus arrested in front of Pilate, basically arrested and being questioned. And this will be the only start. So if we take a good look at this picture, we can see that Jesus is arrested and is in front of Pilate and is being questioned. So this is the start of where Jesus, with the 14 stations, the 14 stations of the cross. Jesus is condemned to death. Jesus is given his cross. Jesus falls down for his first time. Jesus meets his mother Mary. 5, Simon and Syrian is forced to carry the cross. 6, Veronica wipes the blood off Jesus' face. 7, Jesus falls down for the second time. And 8, Jesus meets the woman of Jerusalem. Jesus falls down for the third time. And 10, Jesus is stripped of his clothing. 11, Jesus is nailed to the cross, the crucifixion. 12, Jesus dies on the cross. 13, Jesus' body is removed from the cross, the disposition of lamentations. And 14, Jesus' body is placed in the tomb. So what we're going to look at now is that after Jesus stands for trial with Pilate, and Pilate announced to the chief priest and the crowd, "I find no basis to charge this against this man." So Pilate obviously takes Jesus and sends Jesus from Pilate to Herod. On hearing this, Pilate asked if this man from Galilee, when he had learnt that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at the time. When Herod had saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased. This is Luke 23, verses 6. He was greatly pleased because a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see to perform some miracle. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave no answer. Jesus stood there in silence and gave no answer, and just listened. Jesus gave no answer. In verse 10, the chief priest and the teachers of the law were standing there vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him, dressing him in elegant robes, and sent him back to Pilate. That day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this they had been enemies. So basically what we see here is the start of Jesus. We see the start of the 14 stations. We see what happens in the 14th station before Jesus is condemned to death. We see before Jesus is condemned to death, which is the start of the 14 stations of the cross, we see that Jesus is trialed before Pilate, then sent to Herod. Then Herod sent him back to Pilate. And then Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified. And Luke 23 verses 13, Pilate called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I've examined him in your presence, and I've found no basis for you to charge against him. Neither Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death, and therefore I will punish him, then release him." With one voice they cried out, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!" Barabbas has been thrown into prison for insurrection in the city and for murder. And 20, wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And 22, for the third time he spoke to them, "Why? What crime has this man committed?" So Pilate was saying to them again, What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him punished and then released. So for the second time Pilate has said, I've found no crime in this man, and I will punish him and then release him. But in a loud voice the crowd shouted. They insistently demanded that he'd be crucified. They shout and prevail. So Pilate decided to grant their demands. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and they surrendered Jesus to their will, the will of the people. Pilate surrendered Jesus to the will of the people. And if you remember when I started back in this, I was talking from Isaiah 53. And sorry for jumping back to Isaiah 53, but what did Isaiah 53, what was Isaiah 53? Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53, who has believed our message? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like the root out of a dry ground. He had no beauty and majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that should desire him. 3, he was despised and rejected by man, and man's sorrows, and familiar with suffering, like one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. And 4 says, and surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we consider him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. And verses 5 says, Isaiah 53, but he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we were healed. And this is going where Isaiah is foretelling the future about a Saviour that would be born and a Messiah that would come. And this is what the Messiah would happen to the Messiah for the salvation of God's people. So Isaiah 53:1, this chapter continues to speak about the Messiah Jesus who would suffer for our sins. And all the people, such prophecy was astounding, and would believe that God would choose to save the world through the humbling, suffering servant rather than a glorious king. The idea, contrary to human pride and worldly, says, but God often works in a way we don't expect. The Messiah's strength is shown by humility, suffering, and mercy. Here, the will of the people. The will of the people was saying, Herod, release Barabbas. Herod, release Barabbas and give us Jesus. Crucify him, crucify him. So it was the will of the people. Because in Luke 23, verses 25, he released the man. So Pilate released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection, Barabbas, and a murderer, and the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. And this is where we get into the 14 stations now. This is where we get into the 14 stations. Jesus is led away to be crucified. As they led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, and he was on his way in front of the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including a woman who mourned and wailed for him. And Jesus turned and said to them, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. In verses 29, for the time will come when you will say, Blessed are the barren woman, the wombs that had never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will say to the mountains, Fall on us, and the hills cover us. For if men do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? So Jesus is led away to be crucified. And this is where we get into now the 14 stations of the cross. The 14 stations of